It was a quiet evening at the pilot's lounge in Chicago O'Hare Airport. The kind of calm that comes after a long day, when most people are either rushing home or settling into their seats for a late-night flight. But for one senior first officer, this moment of peace was about to be shattered by a call that would change everything. The man we're talking about wasn't just any airline employee. He had worn the uniform of the Marine Corps before donning his pilot stripes. Years ago, he'd served 2 tours overseas, standing shoulder to shoulder with brave men and women who risked their lives every single day. Even now, as a civilian, working for a major commercial airline, he carried those memories with him, memories of camaraderie, sacrifice, and loss. That night, while reviewing some paperwork before heading out for dinner, his phone buzzed on the table. It wasn't a number he recognized, but something told him to pick up anyway. On the other end of the line was a voice he hadn't heard in years, a fellow Marine, someone he used to serve alongside during his time in Afghanistan. "Hey," the caller said, his tone heavy with emotion. "I need your help." The words hit like a punch to the gut. This wasn't the kind of conversation you expected over the phone, especially not from an old comrade in arms. As they exchanged greetings, the caller got straight to the point. A young Marine under his command, a corporal named Ethan, had died tragically during a training exercise earlier that week. His body was being transported back home to California, where his family waited anxiously to say their final goodbyes. But there was more. The caller explained that Ethan's casket needed an escort, someone who understood what it meant to honor a fallen brother or sister, someone who could ensure the journey westward was handled with dignity and respect. And because of their shared history, the caller believed no one else was better suited for the task than the man sitting in that lounge chair right now. For a moment, silence hung between them. He didn't have to think twice. Escorting a fallen service member wasn't just protocol, it was personal. Every Marine knew the unspoken promise they made to each other. If something happened, they'd bring you home. "No matter what, I'll do it," he replied firmly, cutting through the weight of the situation with resolve. "Just tell me what I need to do." The details came quickly. Ethan's remains were scheduled to depart the next morning on a commercial flight bound for Los Angeles. All he had to do was get himself on board and accompany the casket until it reached its final destination. Simple enough, right? At least, that's what he thought then. Little did he know, fulfilling this sacred duty would turn into a battle far beyond anything he'd anticipated, because sometimes the hardest fights aren't fought on battlefields. They happen in places where honor and humanity seem to clash with rules and regulations. As he ended the call and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow wouldn't go as planned. Still, he pushed the thought aside. For now, all that mattered was keeping his promise, to Ethan, to his family, and to the bond he shared with everyone who ever wore the same uniform. Whatever obstacles lay ahead, he was ready to face them head-on. Or so he thought. The next morning, the air at O'Hare was thick with the usual chaos of travelers rushing to catch their flights. Suitcases rolled across tiled floors, announcements echoed through the terminals, and coffee cups steamed in the hands of bleary-eyed passengers. Amidst all this hustle and bustle stood the senior first officer, dressed in his crisp uniform, a quiet determination etched on his face. He carried no luggage, just a sense of duty that weighed heavier than any bag ever could. He arrived at the gate early, wanting to make sure everything was in order before boarding began. But as he approached the counter, something felt off. The gate agent barely looked up from her screen when he introduced himself. Her tone was clipped, almost dismissive, as she explained the situation. The flight was overbooked, and there simply wasn't room for him. "Sir," she said without making eye contact, "we've got paying customers waiting to board. I'm sorry, but we can't accommodate you." His heart sank. Overbooked? How could this happen? Escorting a fallen Marine wasn't just another task. It was a solemn responsibility. He tried to explain, his voice steady but firm. "This isn't about me," he said. "I'm accompanying a casket, a Marine who gave his life serving our country. This is important." But the words seemed to bounce off her like they didn't matter. She shrugged slightly, typing away at her keyboard. "Policy is policy," she muttered under her breath. "If there's no space, there's no space." Frustration bubbled inside him. Was she really saying what he thought she was saying? That rules mattered more than respecting a fallen hero. He glanced around the bustling terminal, searching for someone, anyone, who might understand the gravity of the situation. But everyone else seemed too busy with their own lives to notice. Determined not to give up, he asked to speak to a supervisor. Surely someone higher up would see reason. When the manager arrived, he launched into another explanation, laying out the importance of his role and the significance of ensuring the Marine traveled home with dignity. But instead of offering support, the manager only repeated what the gate agent had already said. Operational priorities came first. Delaying the flight or bumping a paying customer to make room for him wasn't an option. Things escalated quickly. Passengers waiting in line began to take notice, craning their necks to see what the commotion was about. Some looked sympathetic, others appeared annoyed, eager to get on the plane and reach their destinations. Voices grew louder, tempers flared, and soon the entire scene turned into a tense standoff. Desperate, he decided to try one last thing. He walked directly to the aircraft door, where the captain was doing his pre-flight checks. Another veteran, he thought. Surely this man would understand. But even here he found no allies. The captain listened politely but ultimately shook his head. Company policy, he said, left him no choice. Without explicit approval from upper management, there was nothing he could do. Time ticked by mercilessly. The clock on the wall mocked him as minutes slipped away. Finally, the boarding process started, and the reality hit him like a punch to the gut. The plane was leaving without him. As passengers filed past, some giving curious glances, others completely oblivious, he stood frozen, watching helplessly as the aircraft prepared to taxi down the runway. It wasn't until the engines roared to life and the plane began moving that the full weight of what had happened crashed over him. Here he was, a man who had sworn to protect and honor those who served. And he'd failed. Failed Ethan, failed his family, failed the promise he'd made to bring him home with respect. Anger burned inside him, hot and sharp, but beneath it lay a deeper pain. Shame. Shame that he hadn't been able to fight hard enough, push back enough, or find a way to make them listen. He clenched his fists, staring out the window as the plane carrying the casket disappeared into the distance. What happened next caught him completely off guard. Unbeknownst to him, one of the passengers on that flight, a retired Navy SEAL sitting near the front row, had overheard fragments of the argument at the gate. Outraged by how the airline treated a decorated officer entrusted with such a profound mission, the man pulled out his phone and recorded a short video. In it, he recounted the story, his voice trembling with emotion as he condemned the airline's actions. "This isn't just about inconvenience," the SEAL said, looking directly into the camera. "This is about honoring someone who gave everything, and they refused to let him do his job. It's disgraceful." Within hours, the video went viral. Social media exploded with reactions. Comments poured in from veterans, active duty service members, families of fallen heroes, and ordinary citizens alike. Everyone wanted answers. Why had the airline prioritized profit over principle? How could they turn their backs on a Marine, escorting a fallen comrade? As news outlets picked up the story, public outrage reached fever pitch. Headlines screamed accusations, calling out the airline for its lack of compassion and understanding. Veterans organizations rallied behind the senior first officer, demanding accountability. Politicians chimed in, promising investigations into corporate policies that failed to prioritize human decency. Caught in the eye of the storm, the man found himself thrust into the spotlight. Reporters called non-stop, asking for interviews. Friends and strangers reached out, offering words of encouragement. Yet through it all, one thought consumed him. Ethan still needed to be brought home. No matter what obstacles remained, he vowed to finish what he started, even if it meant going through hell to get there. The video posted by the retired Navy SEAL spread like wildfire. Within hours, it felt as though the entire nation was talking about what had happened at O'Hare Airport. Social media platforms lit up with hashtags supporting the senior first officer and condemning the airline's actions. News anchors on every major network discussed the incident during their broadcasts, holding up pictures of the officer in his uniform, alongside images of the young Marine whose remains were being transported. The story struck a nerve. It wasn't just about one man or one flight anymore. It was about respect, honor, and whether institutions could still hold true to values greater than profit. As the backlash grew louder, pressure mounted on the airline to respond. At first they stayed silent, perhaps hoping the storm would blow over. But when thousands of people began canceling flights and posting scathing reviews online, executives realized they couldn't ignore the situation any longer. Late that evening, an official statement appeared on their website. "We deeply regret the circumstances surrounding this incident and are actively working to ensure such a misunderstanding never occurs again." But words weren't enough for the public. People wanted action, not apologies. Calls for accountability echoed across forums, comment sections, and even petitions demanding systemic changes within the company. Veterans groups organized protests outside the airline's headquarters, holding signs that read phrases like, "Honor our fallen," and "Profit over patriots, never again." Even politicians got involved, calling for investigations into how corporate policies handled military-related missions. Amidst all the chaos, the senior first officer found himself caught in the middle of something much bigger than he'd anticipated. Reporters camped outside his home, thrusting microphones toward him whenever he stepped outside. Messages flooded his phone, some offering support, others asking for interviews, and a few criticizing him for not fighting harder against the airline's decision. Despite the overwhelming attention, he remained focused on one thing: making sure the fallen Marine reached his final destination with the dignity he deserved. Behind closed doors, the airline scrambled to salvage its reputation. Executives held emergency meetings, debating how far they were willing to go to fix the damage. Finally, late that night, a solution emerged. They arranged for a private charter flight to Los Angeles, ensuring the senior first officer could catch up to the casket and complete his mission. Representatives from the airline personally escorted him to the aircraft, apologizing profusely and promising that nothing like this would happen again. When the small jet lifted off the runway, the weight of everything that had transpired pressed heavily on the officer's shoulders. Sitting alone in the cabin, he stared out the window at the dark expanse below. His mind replayed the events of the past 24 hours, the argument at the gate, the captain's refusal to intervene, the anger and frustration that followed. Yet through it all, one thought kept surfacing: Ethan. This wasn't about him. It was about bringing Ethan home to his family. The flight to Los Angeles passed in a blur. When the wheels touched down, he was greeted by members of the Marine Corps, honor guard standing tall and solemn in their dress blues. As he stepped off the plane, they saluted him, not because of rank or title, but out of respect for the role he played in honoring a fallen brother. For the first time since the ordeal began, he felt a glimmer of peace. Together they made their way to the mortuary where Ethan's casket awaited. Inside, the room was quiet, except for the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead. The flag draped, coffin sat in the center, a stark reminder of the sacrifice made by someone so young. Standing beside it, the senior first officer took a deep breath, allowing himself a moment to reflect. He thought about Ethan's family, the parents who had raised him, the siblings who had grown up alongside him, the friends who would miss his laughter. He thought about the life cut tragically short and the legacy left behind. For a brief moment, guilt crept in. Had he done enough? Could he have fought harder back at the gate? But then he remembered something important. This wasn't about him. It was about Ethan. And while the journey had been fraught with obstacles, he had refused to give up. He had vowed to see the mission through, no matter the cost. Now, standing here, he knew he had fulfilled that promise. Word of his arrival spread quickly. Local news crews gathered outside the mortuary, capturing footage of the scene. Family members arrived soon after, their faces etched with grief but also gratitude. One by one, they approached the senior first officer, shaking his hand and thanking him for accompanying Ethan on his final journey. Their words carried a weight that went beyond mere politeness. They were heartfelt, genuine, and filled with appreciation for the effort he had made to ensure their loved one came home with honor. That night, as he lay in a hotel room trying to sleep, the events of the day replayed in his mind like a loop. The viral video, the protests, the apologies from the airline, all of it seemed surreal, yet none of it mattered compared to the image of Ethan's family standing beside the casket, finding solace in knowing their son hadn't been forgotten. In that moment, he realized something profound. Sometimes, the hardest battles aren't fought on battlefields or in boardrooms. They're fought in moments like these where humanity is tested and choices define who we are. He drifted off to sleep with a renewed sense of purpose. Tomorrow would bring another chapter in this unfolding story, but tonight he allowed himself to rest, knowing he had done everything in his power to honor a fallen hero. The next morning, the senior first officer woke up feeling a mix of emotions. Exhaustion tugged at him. He hadn't slept much, but there was also a sense of resolve. He knew today would be different. Today wasn't about arguments at gates or corporate policies. It was about paying tribute to a life cut tragically short. It was about standing alongside a grieving family and ensuring that Ethan's memory was honored in the way he deserved. By mid-morning, word had spread throughout the community about the fallen Marine and the officer who had fought so hard to accompany him home. People began arriving at the mortuary early, some traveling from hours away just to pay their respects. Veterans showed up in uniform, standing tall despite the weight of their own memories. Friends and neighbors brought flowers, flags, and handwritten notes. The parking lot filled quickly, and soon the line of visitors stretched far beyond the entrance. Inside, preparations were underway for the memorial service. Rows of chairs had been set up, each draped with a small American flag. A podium stood at the front, flanked by photos of Ethan, smiling, laughing, full of life. His family sat quietly nearby, their faces pale but composed, holding on to one another as if drawing strength from shared sorrow. And then there was the casket, resting solemnly in the center of the room, covered with the stars and stripes. When the officer walked in, wearing his crisp uniform once again, the atmosphere shifted slightly. Conversations paused, heads turned, and eyes followed him as he made his way to the front. He didn't seek attention, but it found him anyway. For many in the room, he represented more than just an escort. He symbolized resilience, determination, and the lengths someone would go to keep a promise. As the service began, the room fell silent. One by one, people stepped forward to share stories about Ethan. They spoke of his kindness, his humor, his dedication to serving others. Some cried, openly while speaking. Others managed to smile through their tears, remembering moments that brought joy even in the midst of heartbreak. Each story painted a picture of a young man loved deeply by those around him. A son, a brother, a friend, a Marine. Then it was the officer's turn to speak. He took a deep breath before approaching the podium, his hands gripping the edges tightly, as he looked out at the sea of faces before him. For a moment he hesitated, unsure where to begin. How do you sum up the gravity of what had happened over the past few days? How do you put into words the emotions swirling inside you? Finally, he started slowly, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. I never met Ethan, he admitted, pausing to let the words sink in. But I wish I had. He went on to explain how he'd come to be part of this journey. The call from an old comrade, the struggle at the airport, the viral video, and the whirlwind of events that followed. He didn't shy away from admitting the mistakes made along the way, including his own frustration and anger. But he emphasized one thing above all else. Ethan's sacrifice mattered. His life mattered. And no obstacle, not policy, not profit, not anything, should ever overshadow that truth. I'm here because Ethan deserves better, he continued, his voice growing stronger. We owe him better. We owe every service member who has given everything for this country better. The room erupted into applause, soft at first but building steadily until it filled the space entirely. Tears streamed down cheeks, hands clapped together, and hearts swelled with pride. It wasn't just for the officer, it was for Ethan, for his family, and for everyone who had ever worn a uniform. In that moment, the divide between civilian and military felt smaller, bridged by a shared understanding of sacrifice and gratitude. After the service ended, the officer stayed behind to speak with Ethan's family privately. They thanked him repeatedly, their voices trembling with emotion. One of Ethan's younger siblings handed him a folded piece of paper, a note written specifically for him. Inside, it simply read, "Thank you for bringing my big brother home." Holding the note in his hand, the officer felt a lump rise in his throat. This was why he'd fought so hard. Not for recognition or redemption, but for moments like these. Moments where humanity shone brightest, reminding everyone present of what truly mattered. Outside, the crowd lingered longer than expected. Strangers hugged one another, sharing stories of their own connections to the military. Veterans exchanged salutes, nodding silently in mutual respect. Even reporters covering the event seemed moved, lowering their cameras momentarily to witness the raw emotion unfolding before them. Meanwhile, back at the airline's headquarters, executives watched the coverage unfold with a mix of relief and unease. Public opinion had shifted dramatically since the initial backlash. While criticism still lingered, many praised the company for stepping up and arranging the private charter flight. Some even acknowledged the difficulty of balancing operational needs with moral obligations, a conversation that resonated far beyond the walls of the airline industry. In response, the airline announced sweeping changes to its policies regarding active and retired military personnel. From now on, any service member escorting remains would receive priority seating regardless of booking status. Additionally, they pledged to support similar missions in the future, working closely with veteran organizations to ensure proper protocols were followed. These decisions weren't made lightly. They came after countless hours of reflection, discussion, and soul-searching. For the senior first officer, though, the real victory wasn't in policy changes or public apologies. It was in the unity sparked by tragedy. What had started as a single act of defiance against injustice had grown into something larger, a movement that reminded people of the values worth fighting for: compassion, honor, respect. As the day drew to a close, he stood outside the mortuary, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky turned shades of orange and pink, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Around him, life continued moving forward, cars pulling away, families saying goodbye, the hum of distant traffic fading into silence. Yet in that quiet moment, he felt a profound sense of peace. Ethan's journey wasn't over yet. There would be more ceremonies, more goodbyes, and eventually a final resting place where his memory could live on forever. But for now, the hardest part was done. The officer had kept his promise. He had brought Ethan home. In the weeks that followed the memorial service, the story of the senior first officer and his battle to honor a fallen Marine continued to resonate far beyond what anyone could have imagined. It wasn't just a tale of one man's determination. It became a reflection of something deeper, a reminder of the values that bind us together as a society. People talked about it at dinner tables, in classrooms, and even in boardrooms. The incident sparked conversations about respect, sacrifice, and how institutions should treat those who serve. For the officer himself, life slowly began returning to some semblance of normalcy. He went back to work, climbing into cockpits and guiding planes across skies once again. But things were different now. Every time he put on his uniform, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Flying wasn't just about transporting passengers from one place to another. It was about carrying people safely to destinations that mattered. Whether they were traveling for joy, business, or heartbreak, each journey had meaning. And he was determined to honor that meaning every single day. The public's reaction didn't fade quickly either. Letters poured in from all over the country, some addressed directly to him, others sent to the airline or shared online. Many came from veterans thanking him for standing up when it mattered most. Some were written by families of fallen service members, expressing gratitude for shining a light on an issue rarely discussed. One letter, penned by a young girl whose father had died in combat, stood out. She wrote, Thank you for showing me that people still care about heroes like my dad." Reading those words brought tears to his eyes. It was a stark reminder that actions, no matter how small they may seem, can ripple outward and touch lives in ways we never anticipate. As news outlets continued covering the aftermath of the incident, invitations started arriving, from schools wanting him to speak at assemblies, community groups hosting events to honor veterans, and civic organizations eager to hear his story. At first, he hesitated. Public speaking wasn't something he enjoyed, and the thought of reliving the emotional turmoil made him uneasy. But then he realized something important. This wasn't about him. If sharing his experience could help keep the conversation going, if it could inspire others to think more deeply about honor and sacrifice, then he owed it to Ethan and everyone else who had served to say yes. His first speaking engagement was at a local high school. Standing in front of a packed auditorium filled with teenagers scrolling on their phones or whispering to friends, he wondered if he'd be able to hold their attention. But as soon as he began talking, the room fell silent. He didn't sugarcoat anything. He told them about the argument at the airport gate, the frustration of being turned away, and the guilt he felt when the plane took off without him. He described the weight of knowing he had failed, at least temporarily, in fulfilling his duty. And he ended with a message he hoped would stick. Doing the right thing isn't always easy. Sometimes it means standing alone, pushing back against rules that don't make sense, or fighting for something bigger than yourself. But if you believe in it, you have to keep going. By the end of his talk, the students sat quietly, many visibly moved. When the Q&A session began, hands shot up across the room. They asked questions about his time in the Marines, how he coped with failure, and what advice he had for young people thinking about joining the military. For the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful, not because of the applause or admiration, but because he saw curiosity and empathy in their eyes. These kids, despite growing up in a world often disconnected from the realities of war, cared. That gave him faith in the future. Meanwhile, the airline underwent its own transformation. What had started as a PR nightmare turned into an opportunity for growth. Executives held meetings with veteran advocacy groups, listening intently as leaders explained the unique challenges faced by service members and their families. Policies were rewritten, training programs implemented, and partnerships formed to ensure smoother coordination during similar missions in the future. The changes weren't perfect, they couldn't undo what had happened, but they marked a step in the right direction. Employees within the company noticed the shift too. Pilots, flight attendants, and ground staff began wearing pins shaped like folded American flags on their uniforms, a subtle yet powerful symbol of solidarity. Conversations around water coolers and break rooms revolved less around passenger complaints and more about how they could better support those who sacrificed so much. Slowly but surely, the culture within the airline evolved, driven by a collective desire to do better. Back home, the officer found solace in reconnecting with old friends from his Marine Corps days. Over beers and late-night phone calls, they reminisced about their time overseas, the camaraderie, the hardships, and the unbreakable bonds forged under pressure. Talking about it helped ease the lingering ache of guilt he'd carried since the incident. His buddies reminded him that no one expected perfection. All anyone could ask for was effort, and he had given everything he had. One evening, while flipping through TV channels, he stumbled upon a documentary featuring interviews with veterans and their families. The filmmakers had reached out to him weeks earlier, asking permission to include footage of the viral video and snippets of his speeches. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, assuming it would get lost among countless other stories. But seeing it now, watching the faces of strangers moved to tears by what had transpired, left him speechless. This wasn't just his story anymore. It belonged to everyone who had been touched by it. As months passed, the initial frenzy surrounding the incident gradually faded from headlines. Life moved forward as it always does. Yet the impact remained. Veterans reported feeling more respected during travel, noting gestures like priority boarding and heartfelt thanks from airline staff. Teachers incorporated the story into lesson plans, using it as a case study on ethics and leadership. Even memes popped up online, poking fun at corporate missteps while celebrating the officer's persistence, all lighthearted reminders that humor and humanity could coexist. Through it all, the senior first officer kept flying. Each takeoff and landing carried new meaning, not because of where the plane was headed, but because of who might be on board. A soldier reuniting with family after deployment, a grieving parent visiting the grave of their child, an immigrant chasing dreams in a new land. Every passenger had a story worth honoring, and he vowed never to lose sight of that. Late one night, as he prepared for bed, he glanced at the note Ethan's sibling had given him, the one that read, "Thank you for bringing my big brother home." He picked it up gently, running his fingers over the creases. It wasn't just paper, it was proof that even in moments of chaos and despair, humanity could shine through. Proof that no act of kindness, no matter how difficult, ever went unnoticed. And with that thought, he placed the note back on his nightstand, switched off the light, and drifted off to sleep. Tomorrow would bring another flight, another chance to make a difference. And he was ready. Months had passed since the whirlwind of events that changed everything, yet the senior first officer still found himself reflecting on what had happened. Life had settled into a rhythm again. Planes took off and landed, passengers boarded and disembarked. But the lessons learned lingered like an echo. They weren't loud or intrusive, instead they were subtle reminders woven into his daily routines. Each flight carried with it a renewed sense of purpose, as if every journey now held a bit more weight than before. The airline, too, was different. What had once been a faceless corporate entity became something else entirely, a workplace where employees actively sought ways to honor service members and their families. Ground staff greeted veterans with warm smiles and sincere gratitude. Flight attendants went out of their way to ensure military personnel traveling home received extra care. Even passengers noticed the shift, often commenting in post-flight surveys about how much more personal and meaningful their experiences felt. It wasn't just policy changes. It was a cultural transformation born from a single moment of failure turned into opportunity. For the officer, though, the most profound change wasn't external. It was internal. He realized that while he couldn't control every obstacle life threw at him, he could choose how to respond. That fight at O'Hare Airport hadn't defined him. It had revealed him. It showed who he was when pushed to his limits, when faced with a decision between giving up or pushing forward. And though the battle had been tough, it reminded him why he'd chosen this path in the first place: to serve, protect, and honor. Ethan's memory stayed with him, not as a burden, but as a beacon. Whenever doubt crept in during challenging moments, whether it was navigating bad weather or dealing with difficult passengers, he thought about the young Marine whose life ended far too soon. Thinking about Ethan grounded him, reminding him that even amidst chaos, there was always something worth fighting for. The invitations to speak continued coming in, each one offering another chance to share the story and keep the conversation alive. One particularly memorable event took place at a veterans convention in Texas. Hundreds of former service members gathered under a massive tent, swapping stories and sharing laughter over barbecue ribs and cold drinks. When it was his turn to take the stage, he stepped up to the microphone feeling both humbled and nervous. This wasn't just any audience. It was a room full of people who understood sacrifice better than anyone else. He started by thanking them, not just for their service, but for teaching him what true strength looked like. Then he dove into the story, recounting every detail without holding back. He talked about the frustration, the guilt, the anger, and finally, the redemption. By the time he finished, the tent was silent except for the sound of sniffles here and there. Men and women who had seen war and loss firsthand nodded along, some wiping tears from their eyes. Afterward, dozens approached him to shake his hand, hug him, or simply say, "Thank you." One elderly veteran handed him a challenge, coin engraved with the Marine Corps emblem. "You earned this," the man said gruffly, his voice thick with emotion. The officer accepted it solemnly, knowing it represented far more than metal and paint. Back at work, colleagues began treating him differently, not with awe or reverence, but with quiet respect. Pilots invited him to join informal gatherings after shifts. Cabin crew members shared stories of their own connections to the military. Even passengers recognized him occasionally, stopping mid-aisle to express gratitude or ask questions. These interactions taught him something unexpected. Vulnerability wasn't weakness, it was a bridge. Sharing his struggles opened doors to deeper connections, proving that honesty and authenticity resonated universally. At home, the walls of his apartment told the story of his journey. Framed letters from strangers hung alongside photos of Ethan's family and mementos from speaking engagements. Every item served as a reminder of where he'd been and how far he'd come. Yet amid all these tokens of recognition, one stood out above the rest. The folded American flag presented to Ethan's parents during the memorial service. They had insisted he keep it, saying it belonged to someone who understood its significance. Now it rested proudly in a glass case near his front door, welcoming visitors with its symbolism of sacrifice and hope. As time went on, the nation seemed to remember the incident less vividly. News cycles moved on, social media shifted focus, and attention turned elsewhere. But within certain circles, the veteran community, advocacy groups, and loyal customers of the airline, the impact endured. Conversations sparked by the controversy evolved into broader discussions about supporting service members beyond symbolic gestures. Schools adopted programs to teach students about military history and civic responsibility. Corporations reevaluated their policies, ensuring they prioritize compassion over convenience. Change, though slow and incremental, was happening. One evening, while scrolling through social media, the officer stumbled upon a post from Ethan's younger sibling, the same person who had handed him the heartfelt note months earlier. Attached to the message was a photo of the teenager standing beside a newly planted tree dedicated to Ethan's memory. In the caption, the sibling wrote, "This tree will grow tall and strong, just like my brother. Thank you to everyone who helped bring him home." Reading those words brought tears to his eyes. Here was proof that lives touched by tragedy could still flourish, finding beauty even in pain. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he reflected on everything that had transpired. From the argument at the gate to the viral video, from the private charter flight to the speeches and accolades, none of it had been easy. But looking back, he wouldn't trade a single moment. Those challenges had shaped him, forcing him to confront his own fears and limitations. More importantly, they had reminded him of humanity's capacity for resilience, empathy, and growth. When morning came, he rose early, ready to face whatever lay ahead. As he drove to the airport, sunlight streaming through his car windows, he felt lighter somehow, as if the weight of the past year had lifted, leaving behind only clarity. Today, like every other day, would bring new journeys, new faces, and new opportunities to make a difference. And he was ready. Because ultimately, this wasn't just a story about one man or one Marine. It was about all of us, our shared values, our collective responsibility, and our ability to rise above adversity. It was about remembering that no matter how complicated life got, the simplest truths remained constant. Honor matters, dignity matters, and love endures. With that thought in mind, he walked into the terminal, greeted his crew, and prepared for another flight. Somewhere out there, high above the clouds, Ethan's spirit soared alongside him, and together they carried the promise of a brighter tomorrow.